Good morning. So this is going to be about the MPEP 2100. So this is a very large chapter, and so it's going to be a pretty big video. But I went ahead and broke it up into two parts. So hopefully, that'll kind of help us take some time as we go through it. So first off, starting out, we have the USC 101. This is going to be the first statute that is encountered within the MPEP 2100. And so as you go through that, so we discussed it briefly in the MPEP 700, kind of what that means, and basically that it determines what and who can be patented. So basically whoever invents or discovers an invention is entitled to one patent. And then the basis for double patent, this is the basis for double patenting being statutory. So if somebody is trying to get two patents, then that would go against 101 because they are entitled to one patent. So that would make it that's when it's the same invention statutory. So then the inventor must be the applicant in an application in order for it to be valid under USC 101. And the claimed invention must fall into the four main categories: the article of manufacture, the apparatus, the method, or composition of matter. We'll go into more of those more later. It has to have a utility, which is substantial, specific, and credible. So now keep going into it. Now, as far as what can never be patented, this can be living subject matter. So humans cannot be patented in any form, but microorganisms may be eligible. And those ones are eligible because they are a lot of times engineered and they're modified in some way versus if you have, and they can be developed in some way versus if you have a embryo or fetus, that's not going to be something that can be patented. So now a computer-related invention, that is also cannot be patented unless there's more specificities that we'll come to. And it's all based on the broadest reasonable interpretation. So now we're going to go into the Alice-Mayo guidelines. So this, first off, is going to be a very truncated version of 2106. The Alice-Mayo guidelines are very complicated and definitely recommend reading just because it's pretty interesting kind of how those were arrived at and everything. So the first question that you ask when you're doing the Alice-Mayo test is the invention related to one of the four main categories? So those ones we talked about: the article, method, apparatus, composition of matter. And so if it's a yes, great, you just move on to examination. But if it's a no, then it would be, is the invention wholly directed to a judicial exception? So that would be like natural phenomena, abstract ideas. If it's a yes, then that's bad, right? Then that would lead to another pass. So this is called step 2 within the Alice-Mayo guidelines. And so then you would go to step 2B. And so then you would ask the question, does the additional claimed in elements amount to significantly more or markedly different characteristics? And if it's a yes, then that's good, and you can proceed towards examination. If not, then that would be considered unpatentable material. So if yes to all three, patentable, yay. I mean, ideally you wouldn't want to have a yes to judicial exception, but that's okay as long as you have additional claimed elements. But if it's a no to 1 or 2B, then in that case, it is not patentable. So now for more about statutory matter. So first off, a process is a method of transforming or reducing to a certain state. Then you have an apparatus. So an apparatus is going to be defined as a device or machine developed from multiple parts to perform some function. A lot of times that is pretty clearly identified in the claim, right, when it's referencing a product. That would be an apparatus. An article of manufacture, it's produced from raw materials to give different properties by methods of hand labor or machinery. And then you have the composition of matter, and that's where two or more substances and all composite articles. So just a mixture of all of those. And so each of these categories, it's not necessary for the invention to be firmly in one, firmly in another, or to only be able to be defined by a few of these. As long as it fits in any of these, it counts. And a lot of times, like, there's a presumption of utility, right? It's only if start to dig deeper and can't find it. So going to non-statutory subject matter. So one of those is going to be a transitory form of signal transmission. And so I'm not extremely familiar with this field. And so this is kind of based on the examples that are given in the MPEP. This is kind of my understanding. A non-transitory form would be one that is stored on some kind of RAM or short-term memory. And so basically, if you have so that kind of goes back to a software program is not patentable unless you have it implemented with a machine or hardware. So basically, it has to be non-transitory in that it has to be fixed in a certain place in order to be counted as a patentable subject matter. But feel free to read that in the MPEP just so you have a little bit more understanding there. So then in a human, we kind of briefly talked about that. Any sort of legal contract between two parties. So this is when additional steps are not taken, such as executing by the computer devices. It's purely just the executing of a contract. If it's a computer program, which is just a series of calculation steps or mental processes, this is also a problem that can that you can come across here. So the example, the case law that's given in the MPEP is converting the binary code into a code for computer programming. And again, I apologize, I'm not super familiar with all the computer side, more on the biological side, but basically just when you are converting different math calculations, if it's something that can be done by hand or with a calculator, then it shouldn't be something patentable unless it's coupled with a machine. So then you have your arrangement of printed matter. So the case law, which is given to that. So basically it's saying printed matter on its own cannot be patented, but however, printed indica related to a product could be patented. So the case law, if I'm remembering if it's the right one, is relating to printing certain things on checks as a way to improve where the checks are going. So like if the checks aren't going to the right places or they're not being organized correctly, the printed indica would allow them to be identified in the correct way. And so that would be the reason for, but you can't just patent the printed matter. And then just data in general. And so the examples of that would be any sort of non-tangible data. The hardware must be explicit in the claims. So now when we talk about judicial exceptions, that's going to be laws of nature, natural phenomena, abstract ideas, physical phenomena, mental processes, disembodied mathematical algorithms. So remember, disembodied mathematical, that's where you're just patenting the mathematical equation or the algorithm, and you're not patenting the process of what it's used for, or it's not coupled to a product or anything like that. So then the tax strategy exclusions. Honestly, I think this is just a very interesting aspect that was brought around by AIA in 9/16/2011. So with this one, what is patentable in related to taxes is something that is used solely for preparing a tax filing. So this is an exception to the tax strategy. And if it's used solely for financial management. However, the things that are not patentable related to this would be any strategy for reducing, avoiding, or deferring tax liability. So anything that would be something where you would be reducing the tax burden on yourself, that would be something that would not be patentable. And it cannot be related to any tax strategy. And so I think the reasoning kind of for that is just so that though any sort of loopholes or anything like that, whatever you think about using them, that it's not confined to one person and that it's not giving an unfair advantage to one group, basically profiting off the complexity of a law, of the tax law. So now 112A or B, or in pre-AIA, it was called first and second paragraph. So under this statutory area, claims are given the broadest reasonable interpretation. If a specification is needed to understand a claim, the limitations within a specification should not be read into a claim. So it kind of only goes one way, right? So if you have a term within your claim that you need to understand, you can go to the specification. But if a specification defines, depending on, with some exceptions with like means plus function claims, but if specification is defining a claim in a more specific way than is currently defined, then you can't add that into the claim, right? It has to be already existing. For the scope of the claim, all the limitations must be considered. And so you want to compare the claim as a whole when evaluating the prior art. So that's something that can be really tricky on questions. If it's saying comparing differences in a claim with the prior art, you want to be really careful and make sure that it's clear that you're comparing the claim as a whole and the disclosure as a whole, because you can't just pick out one part of a claim and compare that to the prior art when it may not be related at all to it, right? Temperature can be in a lot of different contexts and examples, and so you can't just take a temperature from a smelting process and compare it to some chemical process, or no, chemical was a bad example, a biological process, right? Because those are two different methods and two different processes, and one doesn't necessarily correspond to the other. So now, as we continue, this is how 112A corresponds to utility. So utility means something that's useful and of real world value. So remember, the deficiency under 101 would lead to a deficiency under 112A, but not vice versa. So that's kind of obvious, right? If there's not utility or an invention is useless, the specification can't have taught how to use. And that's what 112 is about. Or 112A is about mostly, is the specification. So if the specification, there's no way that it would be able to prove something that is already useless. So, but as far as going further into utility, inoperative, if an invention is considered inoperative, then it's not, that would be not producing the results claim. So that's different than if it's imperfect or if it's crude, those don't count as inoperative. Inoperative would be saying that one result is going to happen and then a completely different result happens. That would be an inoperative result. An incredible utility would also be considered inoperative. So an incredible utility, that would be like, some examples given are a flying machine with flapper wings, something where like learning to fly, or changing the taste of food with a magnetic field, right? These are things that are basically, they're incredible utility because they're impossible, is the sort of thing. So that utility must be clearly set forth. So if you are like claiming generic biological activity, or you're lacking a statement as to why it's believed it's useful, then that would be a fail. And so, you maybe don't have to say this utility is, but you definitely have to make it clear that it's used in a method of treating cancer. It's used as a way of converting, just showing how it's useful in the real world. So going more into the broadest reasonable interpretation. So first off, the examiner is going to control the scope of the broadest reasonable interpretation to ensure it's being interpreted in light of the disclosure and not beyond what's reasonable. So if an examiner isn't careful, then they might accidentally give too much to a patent. So this might be a reason for writing comments in a notice of allowance, making it clear what exactly is being allowed. So saying maybe if there's multiple diseases claimed, making it clear that this claim covers cancer because cancer is fully enabled in the disclosure and is fully supported by the disclosure, versus just saying, yeah, I can treat all diseases, so making it, the examiner is going to be the one to kind of control the scope there. So now the wording of the claims gives the broadest meaning unless it's specifically defined in the specs. So even if something seems really broad, if it's specifically defined in the specs, then you must go by that. So an applicant, they can develop their own words. They just have to supply a definition in that case. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. A preamble is generally not given any weight as a limitation. So if you remember the preamble in a structure of a claim, that's going to be the part where it says, the method of, or well, in that case, that could be used to define definiteness. But if you're saying a method of using interleukin to treat cancer, comprising, and then outlining the steps of the method. In that case, that first part, defining what the method is doing, that's not given any weight as a limitation usually. And so in certain cases it is, in that only case really is Jepson claims, because Jepson claims, those are laying out what is going on in the prior art and how this is an improvement. So it kind of is used as a limitation. So now transitional phrases, which are used Indifferent patents would be comprising or including, so that would be something that's inclusive and open-ending. Consisting of, that excludes anything that's not in the claim, and then consisting essentially of, that's an important distinction, that's limited to anything that materially affects the basic characteristics of a claim. So kind of looking for those tricky words, and just making sure that if you see consisting of, then that means that nothing else can be added to whatever that recipe is. So now 112A and B, as far as new uses, new properties does not automatically become patentable. So that's something repeated over and over, even if there's, even if there's some new property of this chemical composition, if it's identical to a chemical composition from 20 years ago, it doesn't matter that now you can see better when you apply it to your eye. What matters is that that composition has already been patented. Now, if you were to claim it as a process, then in that case, that would become patentable. So if it's inherent in the art but claimed as a new property, then it's not necessarily patentable. And so that's important too, just saying, well, it hasn't been defined in the art, hasn't been claimed in the art. Well, that just might be because it's an inherent property. So now if the chemical composition is kind of like what we talked about a moment ago, then the properties claimed do not matter. And this is, again, when you're claiming the composition. So now the exceptions would be, as I had said before, when it's designated as a process rather than using composition claims. So now product by process, kind of going further for that, those are the ones that are characterized by the product and not the process or step. So if you were trying to define a product by the process and not the product itself, because you know that it exists elsewhere, you want to write those claims really carefully that they're not product by process. So then the enabling disclosure, it does not depend on the type of prior art. And so we'll talk more about enabling in a moment. But basically, if it's foreign, domestic, provisional, it doesn't matter which of those you're using. The enabling disclosure, the standard for it does not change. So it has the same standards of enablement. So now an operative prior art can still be prior art for all that's reasonably suggested. So if it's counted, if it's an operative prior art, if it doesn't seem useful, but it fully discloses the application or whatever is being claimed, then it can still be prior art and used. So even for non-preferred embodiments. Okay, sorry about that gap for a second. So even for non-preferred embodiments, it can still be prior art. So then publications which include the post-date filing, those can be used by the examiners of prior art if it's indicative of the art at the time of filing. So then abandoned art, that can be used as prior art when it's referenced in another patent or disclosed in some other way. So that was kind of something we talked about a little bit in access. So basically, if it can be accessed, then in that case, it probably could be used as prior art. So then when it comes to 102E, there's a specific rule concerning canceled matter there. So canceled matter cannot be used as of the filing date. So that's the 102E provision. And so then in that case, it can't be used under 102A2 either. So it can be used under, and this is all pre-IA rules, it can be used under 102A or B when it's in the file wrapper upon publication. So only its publication date can be used there. So then printed publications is prior art. Basically, if it's accessible to the public, then it counts as prior art. So then it's when it's organized by the subject or in some way which would be obvious for a person of ordinary skill to find, then in that case, it would be prior art. So even if access to a library where the item is stored is restricted, as long as a portion of the public concerned with the art can access it, and that they would be considered someone ordinary of this skill of the art, then it would count as printed publication. So now an oral paper that is maybe an oral presentation, that can be considered public if there are written copies which are disseminated without restriction, and again, to people who are ordinary skill of the art. And then internal documents intended to be confidential are not publications. So that all of these areas can be good ones to try out as questions, because if there's something that's saying an internal document was leaked, even though it was supposed to be confidential, that would not be a publication that would not be rightfully used. And a magazine or any sort of mailer is considered prior art when it actually reaches a person, so not based on mailing. Like it might have mailed before, well before the filing date, but it didn't reach a person until after, then in that case, not prior art. So now admissions is prior art. Again, very good area for questions. In the MPEP 2129, a figure which is labeled as prior art would be considered prior art, unless it's the applicant's own work. So if they're saying, this is something that I've made in the past, and here's how I improved upon it, maybe is how they're presenting it, as long as it's the same inventive entity. So again, no inventor is differing there. Any admissions by the applicant do count as prior art. And there's a couple caveats there, so I would be careful and read this section closely. But basically, admissions by the applicant. The preamble of a Jepson claim is considered admission of prior art because you are saying, this is the state of the art at this time, and here's how I'm improving upon it. It can be used, any admissions as prior art, they can be used in obvious or anticipation rejections, even if they're not falling under 102. So even if they're not prior art documents under 102, they can still be used in these rejections. The exception to all of these would be the IDS, right? I've definitely seen this example question before, whether or not the IDS counts as a admission of prior art, and it would not. It's explicitly said in the MPEP that it does not count because they're just putting forth what they have found out there. They're not admitting anything to be prior art. So it's just a listing of references. So then when we can start with species and genus in terms of 102 anticipatory. So if you remember 102, that is the one that is a lot harder to overcome. And so you have 102A that defines prior art, 102B and C that define exceptions. So if a prior art reference is claiming a species versus the claim is about a genus, the species will always anticipate the genus. So then if the species is claimed by reference that clearly names the claimed species, the anticipatory, despite many other species being listed. And there's a little bit of variability here, like if it's among a giant list, and they're not going to necessarily say, oh, of course you anticipated it, because if it's that big of a list, then they're just covering a lot of ground and it's non-specific. So then a generic disclosure will anticipate a claimed species if the species can be envisaged from the disclosure. So maybe there's a generic genus in the specification, but within the claims, but then the specification lays out the species specifically, then that's still anticipating the claimed species. And evidence of combination is not required there. So then from there, we can talk about anticipating ranges. So a lot of times ranges of numbers are given in the claims. And so when it comes to anticipatory aspects of that, that's going to come to the specific examples in the prior art falling in the claimed range would anticipate art. So if it's a range claimed of 30 to 60 and the example is given of 42, perfect, anticipated. Overlapping or touching ranges, those can be a little bit harder to make the argument for anticipation because they can be anticipatory when they're sufficiently specific. So if one of them is defined as 1 to 1,000, and then the claim parameter within the invention is 1,000 to 1,010, then that argument for overlapping or touching might be a little bit more difficult because one of them is a huge range and the other one is a small range. So kind of take some practice there, but kind of look out for those. So then if they're close, but they do not overlap or touch, the claimed range does not anticipate the reference range. So we're talking about non-analogous art or secondary considerations. Remember, those are not for 102. And this will be the last thing we'll talk about in this part. But if you remember when we talked about 102 in the MPEP 700, these caveats cannot be used to overcome an anticipatory. If it directly claims the invention, then you can't say, well, my invention was successful, because their invention would be just as successful because it's the same one. So non-analogous, it can be used to overcome 103, but not 102. If the art only has to explicitly or inherently disclose every limitation, and it's still anticipatory. So that inherently is an important aspect, because that could be an area to kind of trip you up a little bit. And then secondary considerations, that would be commercial success, and again, only related to 103 arguments. and you cannot overcome with the unexpected results or commercial success. So, all right, we'll go ahead and cut out there. Thank you.